The sun beat down on the sprawling garden center behind one of the company's 11 home improvement stores, where rows of flowers and shrubs sat in neat formations, waiting for customers. Christopher Pierce, the owner of the chain, stood in the middle of it all, disguised as a temporary worker. The heat was relentless, sweat already clinging to his borrowed uniform, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on a wiry man in his late 50s, a gardener who moved from plant to plant with a quiet efficiency. The man looked exhausted, his movements slow but precise, his face lined with years of hard labor. Christopher had inherited the company from his father, who had expanded the business rapidly before passing away 2 years ago. Since then, Christopher had tried to keep up, but with 11 stores spread out, he relied on district managers and store managers to handle daily operations. Lately, he'd been hearing troubling complaints: employees overworked, management indifferent, and customer service slipping. He was done listening to secondhand reports. He needed to see for himself. So he'd gone undercover, using a fake name and a carefully crafted backstory. His disguise was thorough: a shaggy beard, reading glasses, and a slouched posture. He was just another temp worker trying to earn a paycheck, assigned to the garden center for the week. "Hey, old man, move faster, we don't have all day." Christopher's head snapped up. A sharp voice cut through the air. A man in his late 30s, wearing a crisp manager's polo, stood with his arms crossed, watching the gardener struggle to lift a heavy bag of soil. The gardener, whose name tag read Marlon, gritted his teeth and tried to hoist the bag onto a cart, but his arms trembled from the effort. "Come on, Marlon," the manager continued, shaking his head. "You've been here forever. You should be able to do this in your sleep, or maybe it's time to retire if you can't keep up." Christopher's stomach twisted. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay in character. He needed to see how far this would go. Marlon finally got the bag onto the cart and wiped the sweat from his brow. His voice was quiet but firm. "I've been working here for 20 years and I do my job just fine," the manager scoffed. "Yeah. Well, customers don't want to see some tired old man dragging around like a snail. Pick up the pace." Christopher felt heat rise in his chest. His gut reaction was to step in, to put an end to this immediately. But if he revealed himself now, he might not see the full extent of what was happening. So instead, he grabbed another bag of soil and placed it onto the cart next to Marlon's. "I got this one," Christopher said, keeping his voice casual. Marlon gave him a grateful nod, but the manager, whose name tag read Derek, rolled his eyes. "Oh, great. Now the temp's helping the senior citizen. Unbelievable." Christopher stayed quiet, but his mind was racing. If this was how Derek treated a longtime employee in front of others, how bad did it get when no one was watching? The next few hours confirmed his worst fears. Derek spent most of his time barking orders at employees while doing almost nothing himself. He belittled Marlon constantly, making snide remarks about his age, his speed, and even the way he spoke to customers. Other employees seemed either too afraid or too exhausted to say anything. By lunchtime, Christopher had seen enough, but he waited. He needed to be absolutely sure before making his move. Then the breaking point came. Marlon was trying to stack a row of heavy ceramic pots when one slipped from his grasp and shattered on the concrete floor. He flinched, immediately bending down to sweep up the shards. Derek stormed over like a thundercloud. "Are you kidding me? That's coming out of your paycheck." Marlon looked up, breathing heavily. No excuses," Derek snapped. "You break it, you pay for it. Or maybe I should just fire you now and save us all some trouble." Christopher saw Marlon's hands tremble. The older man had been nothing but diligent, and yet here he was, being humiliated over a simple accident. Enough. Christopher straightened, pushing his glasses up his nose. "That won't be necessary." Derek turned, eyes narrowing. "What?" Christopher took a deep breath and removed his glasses. Then, with a deliberate motion, he reached up and pulled off the fake beard. The air around them shifted. Employees nearby stopped what they were doing. Marlon's eyes widened in recognition. Derek took a step back, his face draining of color. Christopher's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "I'm Christopher Pierce, and I think we need to talk." A stunned silence settled over the garden center. The employees stood frozen, their gazes darting between Christopher and Derek. The weight of the revelation pressed down on everyone. Derek's mouth opened, then closed, his face shifting from pale shock to something more defensive. His posture stiffened, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Christopher let the moment stretch just long enough for the reality to sink in. Then he turned to Marlon. "Are you all right?" Marlon hesitated, still catching up with what had just happened. His expression was a mixture of confusion and quiet relief. I'll be fine," he said, his voice measured but weary. Christopher nodded, then pivoted his attention to Derek, his gaze unrelenting. "Let's step inside, now." Derek cleared his throat, attempting a weak chuckle. "Mr. Pierce." Christopher held up a hand, cutting him off. "Office, now." His voice left no room for debate. Derek swallowed hard, then turned and started toward the store. Christopher followed, his steps steady, controlled. Employees exchanged looks, but quickly returned to their tasks, not wanting to be caught watching. As they entered the small manager's office in the back of the store, Christopher closed the door behind them. The confined space felt even smaller with the tension pressing in. Derek shifted uncomfortably, trying to adopt a neutral expression. "Look, I had no idea you were." Christopher's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" He leaned slightly forward, keeping his tone level. "You didn't know I was watching, so you acted exactly how you always do." Derek placed his hands on his hips, trying to appear composed. "I was just trying to keep things running efficiently. Marlon, he's slow. I need my team to keep up." Christopher's eyes narrowed. "He's been with this company for 20 years. He knows this store better than anyone, and from what I saw, he's carrying more weight than half the staff combined. Yet you humiliate him in front of his coworkers, threaten his paycheck over an accident." Derek's jaw tightened. "I have expectations. If I don't push people, things don't get done." Christopher let out a slow breath, keeping his temper in check. "There's a difference between leadership and bullying. You don't push people, you break them down. That's not management, that's intimidation." Derek bristled. "I get results." Christopher's voice turned colder. "At what cost? Low morale, high turnover, employees too afraid to speak up. That's not how we run this company." Derek's confidence wavered. He was realizing too late that his usual excuses weren't going to work here. Christopher straightened. "I'm not just here for Marlon. I'm here because complaints have been piling up. Employee dissatisfaction, customer service slipping, and now I see exactly why." He let that sink in before adding, "This isn't a one-time issue, is it?" Derek hesitated, then scoffed. "You think I'm the problem?" Christopher didn't blink. "I know you are." Derek's face darkened, but he said nothing. Christopher continued, his voice firm. "Effective immediately, you're suspended while we conduct a full review of your management practices. You'll be contacted with further instructions." Derek's eyes widened. "Suspended?" Christopher didn't repeat himself. He simply held Derek's gaze, waiting. After a long pause, Derek exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Fine." He turned, yanking open the door and walking out without another word. Christopher followed, stepping back onto the store floor. Employees stole glances but quickly looked away, pretending to be busy. He scanned the area until he found Marlon, who was carefully arranging a display of potted plants. When the older man noticed Christopher approaching, he straightened, his expression unreadable. Christopher stopped beside him. "I want to apologize." Marlon blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For letting this go on as long as it did," Christopher said sincerely. "I should have seen it sooner." Marlon studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You can't fix what you don't see," Christopher exhaled. "No, but now that I do, I won't let it continue." Marlon's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That means a lot." Christopher glanced around at the other employees who were still working but clearly listening. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Starting today, things change. No one here should feel disrespected or afraid to do their job. If you have concerns, I want to hear them." A few heads turned. Some employees exchanged cautious glances. Marlon gave a small smile, the first Christopher had seen from him all day. "That'll take some getting used to," Christopher nodded. "Then we'll start now." And with that, the real work began. Christopher stood in the center of the garden section, scanning the employees still watching him with cautious curiosity. He had made his stance clear, but words alone wouldn't be enough. If he was serious about changing the culture in this store, possibly across all 11 locations, he had to take action immediately. Marlon adjusted a tray of seedlings, his hands steady but his posture still tense. The older man was used to being overlooked, and even after Christopher had stepped in, he looked like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Christopher wasn't going to let that happen. He turned his attention to the assistant manager, a younger woman named Valerie, who had been carefully keeping her distance throughout the confrontation with Derek. She was sorting inventory near the register, but her glances toward Christopher were frequent and uncertain. Christopher approached her, keeping his tone calm but direct. He needed answers. She straightened, clearly bracing for whatever was coming. He asked her how long she had been working under Derek. Her response was measured 3 years, promoted to assistant manager last year. Christopher noted the way she spoke, careful with her words, as if she had learned to navigate difficult situations without making waves. He pressed further, asking if she had ever reported any concerns about Derek's leadership. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she admitted that she had several times to the district manager, but nothing ever came of it. That caught his attention. He asked her if the district manager had ever followed up with employees about the complaints. Valerie shook her head. Derek had always brushed it off, claiming that complaints were just from lazy workers who didn't like being held accountable. Christopher felt his frustration deepen. If concerns had been ignored higher up the chain, that meant the problem was bigger than just one store. He asked Valerie what the biggest issues were under Derek's leadership. She exhaled slowly before listing them: constant belittling, impossible workload expectations, employees afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. Morale was at an all-time low, and turnover had been rising steadily. Christopher asked if she had ever considered quitting. Her answer was immediate yes many times, but she had stayed because she loved working with customers, and she believed the store could be better if the right changes were made. That was exactly the kind of person he needed to keep. Christopher nodded, then addressed the employees nearby, making it clear that if anyone had concerns, they could come to him directly. There was a pause, then a few workers exchanged glances before cautiously stepping forward. One by one, they shared their experiences. A cashier explained how Derek had berated her in front of customers for taking too long with a complicated return. Another worker in the lumber section described being scheduled for back-to-back shifts, with barely enough time to rest. A delivery driver mentioned how complaints about broken equipment had been ignored for months. Christopher listened carefully, taking mental notes. The pattern was clear: Derek had created a toxic environment where employees felt disposable. Worse, the people above him had allowed it to continue. He thanked them for their honesty, then assured them that changes were coming, but promises weren't enough. He had to show them. He turned back to Valerie and asked if she was ready to step up. She hesitated, then asked what he meant. He told her that, effective immediately, she would be stepping in as interim store manager while they conducted a full review. Her eyes widened in shock. She stammered that she wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of responsibility. Christopher told her that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, it was about listening, supporting your team, and making sure people were treated with respect. And from what he had seen, she was already doing that. The other employees murmured among themselves, clearly surprised. A few even nodded in approval. Valerie took a deep breath, then nodded. She would do her best. Christopher turned to Marlon. He asked him what changes would make the biggest difference for the employees who had been struggling. Marlon thought for a moment, then listed a few key things: better scheduling to prevent burnout, proper training for new hires so they weren't thrown into the deep end, and a culture where employees actually felt valued. Christopher nodded. Those were things he could implement immediately. He then made it clear that anyone who had been mistreated under Derek would not face retaliation. In fact, he wanted their input on how to improve things moving forward. The mood in the garden center shifted. The employees who had been hesitant before now seemed more willing to speak up. Christopher knew there was still a long way to go, but this was the first real step. As he looked around at the faces before him, He made a silent promise he wouldn't let himself become disconnected again. This company had been built on hard work, and it was time to make sure that work was respected. He had come undercover to find the truth. Now he was going to fix it. Christopher knew that making promises was the easy part. Following through would determine whether real change took hold. He spent the next few hours walking through the store, speaking to employees in different departments. He wanted to understand the full extent of the issues beyond the garden center. In the plumbing aisle, a stock associate explained how outdated scanning equipment slowed down inventory tracking, forcing employees to do twice the work just to keep shelves stocked. Over in hardware, a newer employee admitted that training had been minimal. He had been expected to learn on the job with little guidance. A delivery crew member pointed out that they were often assigned unrealistic schedules, making it impossible to meet customer expectations without cutting corners. Christopher listened carefully, asking pointed questions. The issues weren't just about Derek's behavior, there were operational inefficiencies that had been ignored for too long. These weren't just personnel problems, they were systemic failures that had been allowed to fester. Before leaving, he gathered the entire team in the break room. Employees hesitated at first, uncertain if they were really being encouraged to speak openly, but as the discussion went on, more of them shared their frustrations. They spoke about inconsistent scheduling, lack of career growth, and how management rarely acknowledged their efforts. Christopher absorbed everything, making mental notes on what needed immediate attention and what required long-term planning. He assured them that Valerie would have his full support as interim store manager and that corporate would be implementing changes across all locations. He emphasized that accountability would go both ways. Employees would be expected to uphold high standards, but leadership would finally do its part to ensure they had the tools and respect they deserved. After the meeting, he pulled Valerie aside. He told her that corporate would be sending additional support over the next few weeks to ensure a smooth transition. He also planned to conduct unannounced visits to other locations, just as he had here, to get first-hand insight into what was really happening within his company. She nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility she was taking on. With everything set in motion, Christopher finally made his way back to the garden center, where Marlon was finishing up for the day. The older man wiped his hands on his apron, giving Christopher a measured look. Christopher told him that Derek's suspension would likely lead to termination after the full investigation was completed. He also mentioned that they were revisiting the company's policies on employee treatment and career development. Marlon listened quietly, then asked if Christopher really believed things would change. Christopher admitted that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to making it real. He then asked Marlon what he wanted for himself, whether he wanted to continue working in the same role, or if he had ever considered moving into a more senior position. Marlon hesitated before admitting that he had once been interested in management, but after years of being overlooked, he had stopped thinking it was possible. Christopher told him that if he was still willing, they would support his development. Marlon didn't answer right away, but there was a shift in his expression, something that hinted at the possibility of hope. As Christopher prepared to leave, he realized that the experience had changed him as well. He had built this company on his father's foundation, but somewhere along the way, he had become too distant from the people who kept it running. That wasn't going to happen again. The undercover visit had revealed more than just one bad manager. It had shown him the cracks in the system that needed to be fixed from the ground up. With one last look at the employees who were cautiously optimistic about the future, Christopher stepped outside. He had work to do, but this time, he wouldn't be relying on second-hand reports. He would be in the trenches, making sure the company lived up to the values it was meant to stand for. Christopher spent the next morning at corporate headquarters, reviewing reports from the other 10 stores. He had instructed his executive team to pull employee feedback, turnover rates, and customer satisfaction scores. Sitting in the conference room, he sifted through the documents, his focus sharpening as patterns emerged. Several locations had complaints similar to the ones he had uncovered at the garden center's strained staff, inconsistent leadership, and a lack of clear communication between management and frontline workers. It was clear that Derek wasn't an isolated issue. The problem ran deeper. He called in his regional directors, a group of 5 who oversaw multiple locations. When they arrived, he studied them carefully. They were professionals, but he could tell some of them were uneasy. They likely knew why they were there. He got straight to the point, asking each director how frequently they visited their assigned stores. The answers varied. Some claimed to check in weekly, others admitted to relying on store managers for updates. That was exactly the issue. They had been trusting reports instead of seeing conditions firsthand. He asked if they had been aware of the complaints coming from the garden center store. One director hesitated before answering. He admitted that there had been reports about Derek's management style, but insisted that it hadn't seemed severe enough to escalate. The others gave similar responses, citing that they had assumed issues were being handled internally. Christopher told them in no uncertain terms that assumption had led to failure. He laid out what he had seen firsthand: employees afraid to speak up, a culture of intimidation, and a disconnect between leadership and the workforce. He made it clear this wasn't about one bad manager. It was about a system that had allowed people like Derek to thrive unchecked. He announced a new policy. Each regional director would now be required to conduct unannounced visits to their locations, speaking directly with employees at all levels. These wouldn't be surface-level walkthroughs, but deep dives into working conditions. Additionally, an anonymous feedback system would be implemented to ensure employees could report concerns without fear of retaliation. The directors nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Christopher could see the shift in their expressions, some realizing they had been too passive, others likely wondering how this would affect their workload. He didn't care about their discomfort. He cared about fixing what had been broken. After the meeting, he made his way back to the garden center store. Valerie had spent the last 24 hours adjusting to her new role, and he wanted to check in. He found her in the back office, reviewing scheduling adjustments. She looked up when he entered, a mix of determination and exhaustion on her face. She explained that she had already started making changes, reworking shifts to ensure proper coverage while giving employees more balanced hours. She had also met with the department leads to discuss immediate operational improvements. Christopher listened as she outlined her approach. She admitted there had been some resistance, especially from employees who were used to Derek's methods and feared speaking up might still backfire. He told her that regaining trust would take time, but consistency was key. He reassured her that she had his full backing, and corporate would provide additional resources to support the transition. Marlon entered the office a few minutes later, carrying a clipboard with notes on inventory issues. He had taken it upon himself to document discrepancies in supply deliveries, something he said had been a long-standing frustration. Christopher reviewed the notes and saw exactly what Marlon meant. Orders weren't arriving in full, which forced employees to compensate by shifting stock around. Customers had likely noticed, which explained some of the recent complaints about availability. Valerie said she had already reached out to the distribution team, but she suspected the issue stemmed from mismanagement at the warehouse level. Christopher told her he would handle that personally. He wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. Before heading out, he stopped by the break room just as a few employees were finishing their lunch. They looked up, some still wary, others more willing to engage now that they had seen him follow through on his promises. One of the younger employees hesitated before speaking, asking if Derek was really gone for good. Christopher told them that Derek's suspension was in place while corporate reviewed his actions, but based on what he had witnessed, he doubted Derek would be returning. The tension in the room eased slightly. One of the senior cashiers mentioned that this was the first time in years she had seen management actually listen to the staff. Christopher didn't take that as a compliment. It was an indictment of how detached leadership had been. He told them that going forward, ignoring employee concerns wouldn't be an option. By the time he left the store, He had a clearer picture of what needed to be done not just here but across the entire company. This wasn't just about fixing one location. It was about rebuilding a culture that had been neglected for too long. As he drove back to headquarters, he made a plan. He would visit each store personally over the next few weeks, just as he had done here. He would speak to employees, observe operations, and ensure that the changes being implemented weren't just words on paper. This wasn't about damage control. It was about making sure his company lived up to the values it claimed to stand for. And this time, he wouldn't be watching from a distance.